Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be in this fine world. You are listening to the Startup Selling Show, talking sales with Scott Tambucci. That's me. Today's episode is a guest episode, and today's guest is Amy Hrehovcik. Amy is a sales enablement pioneer, and sales enablement is a term or a phrase that you might have heard out there, and you might not be quite sure what that thing means, or it might mean different things to different people. It's kind of a relatively new topic or a new phrase out there in the sales world. Good news. We're going to spend a lot of time in the next little bit with Amy defining what is sales enablement and why it's so important for you at your startup as you're growing and scaling your sales organization and your sales process. Amy refers to herself as a revenue human for life and a card-carrying member of #Team Human. After selling enterprise tech for over a decade, she's now pivoted to sales enablement, where she has helped build out 2 sales enablement departments at different companies. She's also been a C-level executive at a startup that's been acquired. So she understands the world of startups and startup founders. These days, she's helping sales leaders launch their first internal sales enablement podcast, which we talk about towards the end of our conversation today. And she says, most importantly, like, who says that learning can't be fun or mad fun, as she says. She's also the host of her own hit show, Revenue Real, the Revenue Real Hotline podcast with about 50, 60 episodes out there. You definitely want to check that out. You can find that at revenuereal.com. And when she's not working, she is found chilling at the beach with her dog Lola and with a book. It turns out Amy lives at the Jersey Shore, and she actually lives very, very close to a place that I used to grow up going to when I was a child living in Southern New Jersey. So the main topic that we talked about today, as I mentioned, is sales enablement. We spent a little bit of time just defining what is sales enablement, because it does mean different things to different people. And I thought it'd be really good to have her help to define that term so you can start to think about what it means in terms of coaching your sales reps, training them, thinking about how you're using content in your sales, how your buyers are thinking about content, how your buyers are thinking about their sales process, because all of those things combined are what comprise your startup sales enablement process. And again, we'll talk a lot more about that in my conversation with Amy. From there, she also gave some really specific tactical advice on how to think through training and developing your salespeople, whether they be SDRs or account executives. And most importantly, how do you go from that founder-led or founder everything sales process into a sales process that can include a team that can help you deliver and scale sales in a way that allows you to make the impact that you want to make with your startup. So that's the gist of the conversation we had with Amy. I think you're really going to enjoy the podcast. She thinks very deeply about this area, or this tether, as I called it, that connects all of the sales training, the sales coaching, the content that you're using, the buyers' buying process, the sellers' selling process, because I think you're going to be able to start to relate that to what you'll need to do as you start building out and scaling your sales team. So that's it for now. Let's head over to my conversation with Amy. Amy, welcome to the program.
God, thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm excited for the conversation on many, many levels. And what I wanted to do first is just give you an opportunity to say, ask when people ask you, like, hey, Amy, what do you do? And I realize there's probably different directions you can go with this question. But when people say, hey, Amy, what do you do? How do you answer that question?
It's funny. There are many directions, but my go-to line is that I'm a revenue human for life. And I know that's a little silly, but I believe that selling is the greatest profession in the world. And so I've sold for a long time. I've built out 2 sales enablement departments. And now I'm, helping sales leaders to launch their first internal sales enablement podcast so that the human beings on their team have an opportunity to learn and grow in a way that is not so stationary and almost untethers people from sitting at the computer. But anyway, I like revenue human for life, so we can go with that.
Okay. So I've heard you say, and I've seen this on your LinkedIn profile, where you say you feel like sales, or believe that sales is the greatest profession. I'm curious to know why you feel that way.
Yeah. So I believe there should be a little asterisk at the end of that line. It's when done properly. But I think, so I was raised by a sales VP, and we were asked every night at the kitchen table, when did we feel butter? My sisters and I, right? When did you feel butterflies in your stomach that day? And the analogy there was, if we did not feel uncomfortable at any point, then we were often reminded, right? Sometimes softer than others, that all growth takes place outside of your comfort zone. And so just for that context, that's how I was raised. And I was also very fortunate in the sense that I was destigmatized very early to, just the stigma of that word in particular. But why do I feel like it's the greatest profession in the world? What other profession is there where you are able to grow yourself and your income and while helping people? And so the analogy that I use is it's like a piece of coal that sits in a mountain for like a million years under 1,000,000 pounds of pressure, eventually turns into a diamond. And that is how I would equate, the journey to developing mastery in this great profession. And, I don't say this as much anymore because I understand my own privilege, and there are implications to that as well. But really, in theory, anyone, right, can try, and they can, work to get to that point where they're again taking on things that are uncomfortable and doing it again and again and again. And there's always a plethora of skills to develop as well. So that's why I think that this is the greatest profession in the world. And it's hard, right? Don't get me wrong. Like, it is absolutely hard. I do not apologize for that hardness. I do not apologize for the numbers, but I think there's so much joy in the journey for those that really understand and appreciate the concept of growing themselves and those around them.
I was wondering if it was because you were hired as the head of Jersey Shore Pucker Promotions when you were 21 years old.
On my 21st birthday. Yeah. Like, I wanted to speak with you. They also gave me a house on the water in Seaside Heights, Scott Sambucci, to house all of the promotional material. And my first action, of course, was to hire my best friend as my personal assistant from the expense account. And interestingly enough, she actually stayed in the alcohol event promotion space, like still works there to this day.
Okay. Interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about what you do. Well, let's talk a lot bit about what you do right now. So as you mentioned, in addition, I want to talk more about the internal podcast that you're doing as we go. I first want to get a definition from your perspective as what is sales enablement? And the reason I'm asking that question is that, I've been in sales almost 30 years. So it's sort of a relatively recent phrase around sales, almost like sales engineer was kind of this new thing 15 years ago. And then customer success was kind of a new thing 10 years ago. And then you hear about sales operations, which is kind of a new thing 7 years ago. And so sales enablement as a concept has been around, but it hasn't really been called sales enablement. So I'd love to get your perspective as to what it means to you so that as we're having the rest of our conversation, people have some more context as to what it is and how you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. It's also how I start any conversation about sales enablement, even with other sales enablement professionals, because to your point, there are no standards yet. Okay, so sales enablement is, let's start with what it's not. It's not a sexy rebrand of the same old sales trainer. For me, sales enablement is about being the voice of the field and voice of the customer internally. And as far as what falls under the scope of sales enablement, training, content, right, which is another one of those annoying fuzzy words that means different things to different people. But we're talking about external content, internal content, coaching, and also process design. But the end goal is, of course, to focus on the human being that is doing and executing on one of the hardest, not one of the hardest profession or job inside the organization. These are the elite corporate athletes, and it's a hard job. And so I think that those in sales enablement, myself included, are really in many ways operating in a position of privilege where we need to keep that in mind, that this is a hard job. And so my job as a sales enabler is to, again, to design the strategy and the tactics for empowering the field, again, including the coaching, the training, the content, and then the process design, as well as delivering and executing. There are lots of people, I think, that have tighter, prettier definitions per se, but I think that I'm excited that most people or a lot more people are starting to speak about what it's not, and how, when we're trying to, I don't know, teach sellers how to persuade, or trying to get everybody, including all the buyers, to operate along our sales process without leaving any room for their unique experiences. You just leave a lot on the table.
It's interesting as you were describing that, I was getting some imagery in my mind that enablement almost encapsulates a lot of what have been historically individual sort of either skill sets or trainings, right? So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like, I'm going to go, I have a field of salespeople, whether I have 2 reps or 20 or 200, I'm going to go get them sales training. So what do? We send them to Miller Heiman, or we send them to some other sales trainer for a weekend, or, have that trainer come in every week for a couple of weeks, and we train them on how to ask questions, or we train them on how to close, or we train them on how to handle an objection. Then there's coaching. Well, coaching is different than training because coaching is sort of ongoing. Then there's content. Well, the marketing team's pumping out content, and we have to make sure we're using our content correctly.
Mm.
And we have to understand our sales process. What do we do with a lead? And then what's the next thing and the next thing? And they've always seemed so isolated to me. So as you described it, it's the first time anybody's described it to me as being this almost cohesive or compilation of all of those things that are the tether between the seller and the buyer.
Yes. And even internally, I think that I have a line that if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes two to raise a competent salesperson. And so in many ways, it's a it's a highly collaborative role in that you're bringing all of the stakeholders inside the organization to the table to essentially align around what the problem is, right? And I'll give you a perfect example. One time I was asked to put together a training on contracting. And I was like, sure, no problem. But let me just dig into like what's going on first, just so I can make sure that what this is the actual problem. And that if we do come up with something that we're going to like get the results that we want. And when I got into it, and I'll spare you the nitty gritty details, I mean, we had a process problem, right? The total amount of time that it took from start to finish on the contracting process, I mean, it was like 6 months. And so
the time that a deal got to contract. So which could have been 6 to 12 months just to get there.
Oh, yes. Well, no,
Yeah,
like let's be serious. I was brought in to help transition the team to enterprise selling. So there was a nature like I would have expected a before and after. But yeah, in that instance, I could have done a training on contracting and, taught the sellers all about the clauses and like whatever, and how to avoid the redlining spiral of doom. But that wouldn't have fixed our actual problem. And so part of, I think, a great sales enablement strategist and an executionist, is that the word? It's not executioner, but is that ability to diagnose what's going on, like truly diagnose the root cause of the problem, and then to develop solutions around it. But not just that, get everybody on the same page, including the sales managers. And one of the things that when I talk about sales enablement, like my job in my head is not done until this new skill or knowledge is retained at 80%, right? Across scale. There's no such thing as like training one single isolated event that is going to accomplish that, right? Quite the opposite. And so part of driving that change, that behavior change internally or leading it, depending on where you are and who you ask, is about understanding how people learn and some of the changes in like the learning of today as opposed to the learning of yesterday, and then designing your, let's call it, project around these proven principles. I'm going to pause there, but it's unusual. Like I'll look at some of these sales enablement positions and it's very obvious to me which organizations get it and which do not. And I would say at this point, we're still at like 80%, right? Falls into the not category. And at least for me, like that's just not interesting to me because I like to have an impact, right? And I like to actually get to the point where I'm helping people to grow into and excel and to progress as human beings first and then as sellers. And I find it very frustrating to, kind of be stuck into a system that I know to be ineffective.
So as you were describing that, whether like you use contract as an example, or like we get this, whether it's an individual coaching call that somebody says, ask this question, or more broadly, you might hear a sales team, like a manager say, hey, we need somebody to come in and teach our reps how to negotiate price. We have a mutual friend, Megan, who introduced us, Megan Mishiak, and she, people are like, how do I negotiate on price? You're like, okay, well, Shirley can do a training on negotiation, but like, why are you getting a price objection in the first place?
Yeah.
Well, it's a tough market this or tough market that, or, these buyers are really, there's a lot of competition. You're like, oh, okay, there's a lot of competition. Interesting. So how are you differentiating yourself versus the competition? in the sales process? Well, it's just like we have these features, we have those features. Okay, well, let's talk about that. And then you go back another step. Well, why are you in these competitive situations in the first place? Like, why go after a market that's so highly competitive? And what is your marketing team doing that's creating it? So you start to unwind. It's like you pull the string of, we need help with negotiating price. And you realize it's not just a ball of yarn. It's like the world's largest ball of yarn. People think they need negotiation help, but what they actually need is a complete revamp of the sales process. And that, to me, is what enablement truly is, because you need to have somebody who can look at that, which is what makes what you do so hard.
It is. So when I was getting my green belt in process design, part of that, you have to facilitate like an actual project. And it was a legal aid organization out of Chicago. And I was working with my mentor. So we were working it together. But we spent and so since this was a nonprofit, we came up with this hybrid project plan to help them like save money and whatever. But we spent a full day with the project team on sussing out the root cause. And right as we're nearing, and we're talking fishbone diagramming and issue spotting, I mean, the whole nine. And so right as we're getting to it, Catherine comes and whispers in my ear, Aim, by the way, 99% of the time, the root cause is either communication or a skill gap. And there were two things that crossed my mind in that moment was like, no way, right? There is no way that is an accurate statement, which it was. And then the second was, if we knew that already, why did we just spend the full day on this exercise? And we could have chosen other, whatever aspects of the day to do or to work on. And she's like, Amy, you could tell people this until they're blue in the face, but unless they experience it and come to this understanding on their own, it won't make a difference. And so I'm laughing because Meg and I on my episode, when she was talking there, we were bantering about how often people want to, get training on like negotiation or price or whatever. And that almost 99% of the time, it comes back to a skill gap in the discovery phase. Right. Yeah. And so I don't know if it's whether people are just in such a rush to get through discovery so that you can actually get to the selling part. Sometimes I see like a commingling of the concept of demo and discovery, which I loved about one of the things that you wrote. It's not even just about their different things, but there's even more than one type of demo, which feels like it's just a different conversation. But yeah, it's almost always about discovery. But again, I'm laughing because I'm remembering having to work with a bunch of sales leaders and we were focusing on discovery, and it was something that I was tasked with. And one of the first things that I did was I had all the leaders on the team come up with two different answers, right? Just two simple questions. What is our problem statement, right? We want to do a training on discovery or a whole series. What's our problem statement? And then what's our objective, right? The objective with the training is. And I knew that what we were going to get back, but I gathered those answers ahead of time so that when I start the meeting, I can show everybody's answers that are all different. I can point at this and say, if we want to stand a chance, right, of really moving the needle as an organization, right, it starts with us all getting on the same page. And I think that it's a critical aspect that true sales enablement professionals bring to the table. But I'm with you. I was raised in large organizations and taught to sell. I finished my career at Thomson Reuters. We call them product marketers. And so, I think it's a very Silicon Valley thing to just, come up with a new name for something and call it innovation and everybody pats themselves on the back. But, whatever, who cares about all the confusion we're introducing into the market?
Okay, folks, we're off and running my conversation with Amy Hrehovcik. And listen, we're talking about sales enablement. Part of that means sales coaching, sales training, learning about how to build your sales process relative to your buyer's buying process. That's a lot of what we do here at Sales Quality is we help early stage, growth stage B2B startups build that repeatable, scalable sales process, not just with, these are frameworks you should be using for outbound emails, or these are the slides you should be using in your product demos. Of course, those are all really important, but also helping you understand what is your sales process? What should your sales playbook look like for your product in your market for your customers that you want to serve? So if you're interested in learning a little bit more or just brainstorming a couple ideas for your startup as you start to grow and scale your sales process, you should maybe look at grabbing some time with me or some of the coaches on our team, and let's have a quick chat. Easiest thing to do is just shoot me an email, scott@salesqualia.com, scott@salesqualia.com. You can just type the word private into the subject line, that would just tell me, my assistant Soretta, who checked my email, to take a quick look at your request. What she can do is schedule some time with me or one of our coaches. We'll have a quick chat, ask you some questions about your current sales process, what you feel like is working well, where you feel like you have some gaps. And again, we can brainstorm some quick ideas and jam on what we can do to help you improve so that you can grow and can scale your startup to make the impact that you want to make. So shoot me a note one more time. That's scott@salespolyat.com. Type the word private into the subject line. And let's grab some time on the phone and let's chat about your startup and your sales process. All right, that's it for now. Let's head back to my conversation with Amy. Well, I appreciate that backdrop. And I know we spent, 10, 15 minutes talking about it, because now that I think we have some context on the complexity that goes into developing proper sales enablement programs, if you will, if you want such an official word on it, for any company, within the mindset of the people that typically listen to this podcast. They're B2B startup founders. Most of them have never done sales as a job like you and I have. They're product people, engineering people, and they will work their ass off to get the first 10 enterprise customers. Product is launched, MVP is built, go out and get revenue, go out and get money. But then, of course, there's a point where they have to get process in place, or they have to get people in place. And the people piece in particular and the process piece, they end up commingling too often, which is like, well, I'm going to hire people that are going to help me build the process. So they go hire some all-star salesperson from the industry, or I'm going to hire some SDRs, and then they're going to figure out our outbound motion for us. And that ends up, of course, being a massive failure. The reason I say all this in context is I want to get your perspective on this, and I want you to maybe teach the people listening why this is so important, because it seems so simple on the outside. You're like, well, I need somebody to do outbound. We need to have an outbound motion. There are these people called SDRs that do outbound. So I hire them, and then they go do the outbound motion for me. I need people to convert deals, and I need people that can sell in an industry. So there's these people called account executives that I can hire, and then they just do that. What they don't understand, in my view, is the almost infinite complexity that goes into the sales motion, the sales process. What does it mean to hire people and train them and coach them and talk to your buyers from their standpoint, not what you're trying to sell? And so, how do you try to talk to people that have this complete misconception, or just truly, I use the word ignorance, not in a bad way, it's just they don't even know all of the things exist that you and I just discussed for the last 15 minutes?
Well, the answer that I would give you if we were on this podcast, I would say that I try not to talk to those people. No, but in all
they need love too.
No, in all seriousness, I think one of the beautiful things about this moment in time, right, COVID, is that we're starting to see a lot more people that are asking questions about why, right? You mentioned the SDR model in particular, SDRs. And so when you think about that, so what I mean by asking questions, it's like, why are we doing it this way? And how did it come to be? And then what results do we think that this is going to yield us? And then, right, let's say 20% win rate for inbound leads. There's a lot of people that are very happy with that number. And I'll stop with that. But who says it can't be better? And so what I loved about what you said is the word complexity. And what I loved about your book is complexity, because part of designing these go-to-market systems is letting go of this idea that there's some sort of turnkey answer, right? I'm going to, or I'm going to stay within the filter bubble of Silicon Valley and look at, what everybody else is doing, who also really haven't been asking themselves why in a long time. But here's a perfect example. The SDR model was started in the early 2000s, right? And so I was full cycle AE, right, listeners? So that means that I was responsible for opening all of my opportunities from moment one. And
same with you. Right
there are certain instances when the SDR model, I think, is a good fit. However, there's a tremendous amount of issues that are created with that model unnecessarily. For example, the SDR AE handoff, right? And so who carries the brunt of the burden of having to have this identical, air quotes, discovery conversation 2 times? The client. It's the friction on the relationship. It's the variation on interpretation of what counts as a qualified opportunity. I mean, the issues go on and on and on. Now, when we dig into it and think why are we doing it this way? Or when was this a good idea? The SDR model was literally designed when email was just starting to be new. and a thing. Right. And so when you think about that high volume of just like throwing a ton of shit against the wall, right, and hoping, you know what, there was also a novelty to getting and receiving emails. Now we just call it digital pollution. And so
we've had Ethan Butte on the show.
Oh, did I don't know.
Yeah.
Is he the one that wrote human-centered communication?
Human-centered communication.
Yeah. That's exactly where I'm getting it from. You knew it too. I love that. So digital pollution. And so anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is that when you're thinking about these go-to-market decisions and these models, think broader. Ask more questions, spend a little bit more time diagnosing what great looks like, right? Do the math on what a 10-point increase in your win rate will do to your profit margins. And, or maybe like, let's look at the average attrition rate, right? We burn through human beings on sales floors. And so that's what I would say to that. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
It does. And so like, I mean, my whole lens of the world is through the eyes of those startup founders. And what you just described, like even that example of the SDR prospecting and then the handoff and who does discovery and how much in depth and what qualifies as a sales accepted opportunity. And all of that in itself is a highly complex decision to make for an enterprise sale, first of all, whether you're selling at Thomson Reuters or GE or as a startup. And then you add the layer that you really don't even have any kind of models of historical models on which to base that, because most startups in the B2B world are selling a product that's never been purchased before.
Yeah, category defining. This is exactly why discovery is so important. And so, Scott, what I would say to that is that we tend to think that decisions, listeners, are very final, right? We worry about them, we stress about them, but the reality is there are not many decisions that can't be changed or reversed. And so what I mean by that is one of the best and fastest ways that you're going to get at that proper model is to start somewhere, start trying one way, right? Let's say you hone in on 3 different options. Again, after you've done the legwork of, okay, what's the buyer's journey look like, right? Buying is always changing. Selling is always changing. Sales enablement is always changing. Are you? And I think the most important thing that you can do as you're designing these go-to-market systems is to create or leave space for some flexibility, right? A dynamic system that grows and iterates. And that is something that you can establish at the very beginning. And so let's say you put some sort of infrastructure in place for a quarter, right? And set your success, your objective, like it will have worked. We'll know it works when blank is a thing. And then here are the 2 success metrics that we're going to measure for right now, and then run with it for a quarter, and then have an after action review with the team and talk about how you can make it better. And also, I think there's a tremendous amount of insights that are coming out right now about where productivity and performance actually come from, right? And I'll give you a hint. Happiness, autonomy, creativity are all big parts of that. And now when I marry this indisputable research with how we treat most SDRs, right? We want to manage what they're doing down to the day and task. Hard stop. Now think about the type of individual that's going to move up through the ranks in that model. Okay. And so that said, I think that we can all, again, like I said, just do a much, much better job asking questions about where this advice or where these models that we're trying to emulate are coming from, why we think they're a good fit for us. But more importantly, just like scrap it all and go back to the drawing board. And again, set your controls around what you're looking to accomplish, make sure everybody's on board with it, and then try it out. And that framework will, and including how the team is working together, will grow and iterate from there.
So now that the person that's listening to this show is feeling utterly depressed about the amount of work and effort and experimentation that goes into just this one microcosm part of the sales process, I want to move into a related topic, which is one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, which is this idea of training humans versus training sellers. Because you just mentioned about the importance of giving people happiness and creativity and the ability to work autonomously. Because I think there is this like, okay, I need an SDR. So they're going to run this sequence and make these calls and do 100 calls a day. And that's the number that I'm going to manage, or that's the number I'm going to track. Even if that does work for a period of time, because the world is changing, as we've seen with COVID in 2020, and it still continues to go on. And now we see economic downturns and lots of budget pressures. That same strategy that worked 2 quarters ago in Q4 when sales were up, all of a sudden stops working. And now you have an SDR that was like, no, you trained me to push the button like George Jetson. And I'm pushing the button, but the sales aren't coming. What do I do now? And now the founder is like, I don't know. Like, we got to figure it all out again. Whereas this idea that I want you to expand on, which is like train the human versus the seller, would allow that person to figure it out on their own. So you talk a lot about training the human versus the seller. How do you mean by that? And what are some specific strategies to help a founder think through that and actually implement on that?
Yeah. So one of my favorite quotes is by Clayton M Christensen, which is the human that wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, among other things. How will you measure your life? He actually passed away last year. Brilliant man. Instead of telling him what to think, I taught him how to think. And then he reached she reached what I thought was the right conclusion on her own. This idea of helping people to make decisions around where to spend their time, how to spend their time, how to assess and analyze. I was just working with somebody yesterday or 2 days ago on how to research, right? And like get at the actual things that you need. And not to say that you want to spend like all this time researching or whatever, because the idea is you get to a point where you're doing it thoroughly and also quickly, but it's spending more time with the individual. It's helping them to understand that persuasion, which is something that is often associated with our beautiful profession, is universally known to be despised by everyone. And so like, let's just think about that one for a second. So like, really persuasion, it's like, to quote Andy Paul in Sell Without Selling Out, it's a blunt force instrument of last resort. And so that would be the opposite, right? Training somebody how to sell, right? You're persuading. And so when you're training the human being, you're focusing more on the relational things. Here's another perfect example. A lot of kids like coming into this profession, right? And we want them to get on the phones. How much time do you think the average 22-year-old has spent having conversations on the telephone?
Well, my wife and I just talked about this with some neighbors. They came over for dinner Memorial Day weekend, and we were both joking about the other day. I called my dad because he called me and I was at the soccer field. Mm-hmm. And he called me. I was like, talk to him for a couple of minutes. I said, look, we got to get the game started. But I said, look, Benjamin's right here. How about you want to say hello? So I called him over and I handed him the phone.
Okay.
He didn't know how to talk into a phone. He's holding it out in front of him and talking into like it's a speakerphone. I'm like, no, you have to hold it up to your ear. And he's looking for the speaker. He doesn't even know how to use a phone.
Think about that. And we get them in and we're looking at these onboarding programs and how quickly can we ramp people up and like they literally have not been on the phones. Like I think about having to reteach someone or reskill them around writing. Most of us were taught about like in like grade school, middle school, whatever. And again, listeners, you're talking to somebody that was in remedial writing for the first year of college. Okay. So it's been a journey for me too. But right now, some of the things that we're seeing with email, right? It's right at a 5th grade reading level, short, sweet, like it's the complete opposite. And so I think that's a big part of it. But also when it comes to training the human being, like there are certain, and again, I'm going to draw heavily from Andy's book here. So listeners, I'm talking about it's Sell Without Selling Out by Andy Paul. I worked on his book launch. And so like full disclosure there, I'm still working. We're now building out the go-to-market for the bulk sales stuff. But anyway, he breaks down the difference between selling out or being salesy, again, that persuasion, whatever, versus selling in, which is a function of influence, right? Another way to think about selling, the goal really is about capturing and directing attention, capturing, maintaining, and directing attention. And so this is a function of influence. And there are 4 pillars to influence, right? First is connection, second, curiosity, third, understanding, fourth, generosity, and they build off of one another. For example, good luck getting to a point where you're able to understand someone if you have not established a strong rapport. And then, of course, learn to ask good questions where you're able to suss out those root causes to the point where you can actually understand what's being said. And so, in many ways, these are, I mean, look what's going on in the world right now, Scott. It's so tense and we've all kind of retreated into our corners. And I don't even say that in a begrudging manner. It's almost like self-preservation. But in many ways, we have to learn how to have these conversations again and learn how to reinterpret that call reluctance, learn how to reinterpret the anxiety, learn how to redefine success as not being based on an outcome, which, by the way, for this profession, we never get, because even if you hit your quarter, what do you get? Like a weekend to celebrate it, and then it starts all over again. And so part of training the human is helping them to rethink that success is in the journey, right? You joked about competition and doing training on competition. Listeners, the only competition that matters in this business is competing against yesterday's version of yourself. And so these are all aspects that are absolutely critical in helping people to, one, establish a foundation, right, in this profession, and then, of course, build it from there. And by the way, what I'm proposing is not something that takes longer, right? Actually, in many ways, it's a lot faster. And
so
I'm not
tell
going
me
to
more about that, because I'm imagining, I mean, I know in my own company, long, detailed conversations with our team that doesn't have direct interaction with customers, doesn't have direct interaction with the market. They don't have 30 years selling experience like me. But they're doing functional tasks that are critical to customer success or to marketing or to sales or to operations. And part of me feels like I'm spending more time doing those things because I know the time investment is necessary and worth it. But the other time it's like, oh man, we got to spend like an hour talking about this one thing. So I'm just maybe pushing back that, to me anyway, it feels longer and harder.
Yeah, it's different. It's like I'm thinking of like when you're trying to bake a cake, like just as one example, and your 7-year-old niece wants to help or 5-year-old niece wants to help. Like, yeah, it's that's gonna take a little bit longer to stop and have to explain, and like pull the eggshells out of the batter.
That's a great, pull the eggshells out. Yep.
But it's like, this is the only way. Right. And you can this is where culture kind of comes in, because like hiring well and setting that scorecard, right? These are the character traits, the core competencies that we're looking for. You can create a culture of learning where people are eager to go teach themselves things and feel safe enough to do so, including making mistakes. But this is actually, I cover as it relates to SDRs, right? And learning. There was a young man that I mentored about, 2 years ago. And yeah, like it was a perfect storm scenario, and we like brought him back to the drawing board or whatever. But I ended up doing a whole podcast episode about it. It's called Day Kong Cracks the SDR Talent Code. And it is about, for me, like when I think about sales and teaching new sellers, it's like building blocks, right? One of the things that people get wrong about this concept of art versus science or left brain versus right brain is that they're zero sum, right? Or binary, right? You can only be one versus the other. And that is nonsense. Number one, there's an art and a science to everything. But more importantly, when it comes to learning these new things, a person needs to understand the science of what they're doing. They have to understand the principles and the building blocks. And once they understand those things, then that's where the art starts to kick in. But the way that I teach SDRs, instead of focusing on the activity or focusing on just like the blasting of and creating all this pollution, it's highly focused on the conversions, right? And we start at the beginning. All right, first let's talk about creating a lead list and looking for those tie-ins and those triggers and whatever. And those, there's a word that I'm losing it, but it's the moment when someone's ready to buy it. It's the whatever. And then you kind of go from there. And so it's first the research, then it's about the outreach, but at that point, that's when I'm going to teach them about A/B testing, right? And looking at comparing two different campaigns at once, with the knowledge that the most important thing for you, seller, at the beginning of your career is understanding the principles of the 80-20 rule, right? You're going to get 80% of your results from 20% of your activities. Your job is to find what those 20% things are so that you can do two things. One, lots more of it, but also stop doing the things that don't work. And this also ties into, training the human being as well, right? When we're able to move away from this concept of activity and move towards effectiveness, right? It's just a game changer. And people are able to understand these principles early on. The challenge is that we're not teaching it this way. And so again, I would point people at those two things, that one episode, which I'll send you after, as well as I actually did an episode on the 80-20 rule too, because I think it should be required learning for everyone stepping into this profession.
Yeah, I mean, as you're describing it, I was also thinking about, if you're a founder and you've gotten, let's call it the first 10 enterprise sales, you got a couple 100,000 in revenue, and now you're trying to, get to the magic million. And then if you're at $1 million, you're trying to get to 3 and then 10. So much of those early customers came from that founder magic that gets sprinkled on deals. And it's interesking because
also known as the warm market.
The warm market. Yeah. I mean, you run into sales, and we had this at every startup I ever worked at as a head of sales. You're like, how did we get that customer? I don't know. It was Goldman Sachs. Oh, that's why, because they're always looking for new stuff. But part of it is they go from this very sort of qualitative kind of process, because it's based on feel and conversations with warm leads and just being able to talk the certain language with a prospective customer, to like, now I want process. And it's like almost binary. And the expectation is we're just going to go from founder-led selling to now sales process. And it's not like that. And so under the context of sales enablement, it's that middle layer where it's a transition zone where the founder has to sit and talk to SDRs or AEs or CS or marketing or whoever and help explain why did they get those customers? How did they get? What did they see? What did they hear in the intonation of the voice of the person when they asked the question and got the answer? Because it's too much like, well, no, just ask these questions. And if the answer is yes, move them to opportunity.
Being identified, check.
Yeah. And I've heard you talk about this in other podcasts as well. So I think the lesson, for everyone, I hope, is that this middle layer, it really is the tether, I use that word again, between going from just straight up like, I want to grow sales by process, from this going from founder-led selling. It really needs to be this transitional phase, this educational phase, the time that you're going to invest and spend. Because if you don't do that, then the process is never going to work, no matter how good it might be designed.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to add something to that. And so when I made that joke about founders, listeners, I have a heart for founders as well. I was a C-level startup acquired. Like, I know it. I've done the due diligence. I was actually acquired by my former leadership team at Thomson Reuters. Like, I get it. When you're thinking about process, like, process is the first principle of process. Process is designed to value flows at the pull of the client, right? And again. So value flows at the pull of the client. In the way that most people think and understand process, that air quotes client is the company. So they understand what amount of revenue is coming at any given point. And it's the shareholders or the VCs. There's always going to be friction in a process designed that way, always, hard stop. And so one of the things that you can do to avoid that early on is to, decide which stages you're going to run with. And by the way, all the cool kids these days are putting in a stage called the mutual planning stage. So where the seller and the buyer is able to talk about like the buying process and then like what all those things, whatever. So that one's for free. But what you want to do is you want to put the controls right so that everyone on the organization knows that these are the things that need to happen in order for the opportunity to move from stage B to stage C. And at least when you've got those, and maybe even, I don't know, set up some validation rules in your CRM so that there's some like data integrity there as well. But when you're able to, or when you've done that properly, you can start to look at your conversion rates in the same way that we just talked about teaching SDRs to use their conversion rates. And that is a far more effective way to launch a process, but also to iterate on actually what's working and what's not. Again, with the goal is, right, you want to leave enough room inside these stages at the beginning so that you're able to identify your bright spots, right? I think this was a concept from the Heath brothers wrote a couple of years ago, Made to Stick. And Scott, real quick, it was a story about there was, children were dying from hunger in India, right? It was awful, one of the worst places in the world. And so humanitarians, this is going back to the 80s, I think, humanitarians from all over the world were flooding in and everybody was trying to solve the childhood mortality rates in rural India to no avail, right? Nobody was moving the needle until this one crew came in, and instead they tried something different. They gathered the data, they looked at what was going on, and they found some outliers and like where children weren't dying. And so instead they decided to go investigate, why is this, what is going on right here that is working so well? And so when they did that, they were able to find that inside these villages, all of the families were pooling resources. They were cooking together and they were feeding their children together. And so once they had identified this bright spot, then this humanitarian crew, they took this concept and they scaled it out across the country, right? And instead of being outsiders with this outside solution that was going to come and fix all of their problems, they just merely socialized the fact that, look, this is what your neighbors are doing and their children are dying less. And so try these things. And so when you're able to set those controls inside those processes and make sure, again, everyone set the validation rules, make sure everyone understands the checklist and is following them, then your bright spots will start to present themselves. And your job at that point is to go grab them and to investigate what's going on and to socialize them so that the rest of the team knows what's working and can start to implement them. And that is essentially what the winning teams who are growing and adapting quickly right now are doing.
Yeah, there's so much there. I mean, it's just a matter of then because then all you're doing is training on how to get those check boxes checked. And that's a much more human approach as opposed to how do you get a deal from qualified to opportunity? How do you get from opportunity to contract or proposal or whatever?
Yeah, and
because that's like the fabric in between the stages that matters the most. If you skip over that, then there is no connection and you're just moving deals through the pipeline. And 9 out of 10 deals, you're like, oh, it's in proposal stage. And then they get back to you on the 19th and never, because it's in proposal stage when it shouldn't be in the first place, because you didn't check the earlier boxes that you should have checked.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Awesome. So like you'd probably go, I know you could probably go 3 more days talking about this stuff, but we got to get you on your way. I would like you to talk though about the internal podcast that you're helping sales leaders set up, because I feel like it's like as you're describing everything that you're describing around sales enablement, it almost feels like a necessary component to training an organization, whether you're a 3-person sales team or obviously the bigger the team, maybe the more important because of the necessary communication that you were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. And trying to figure out like, how do I get these ideas across to whether it's 2 reps or 30, especially in a disaggregated world where you don't have the luxury of just sitting in the same office with the founder every day, every hour. So talk to me a little bit about why you're setting this up and what some of the expectations are for people.
Yeah. So I have ADHD, and part of which, contrary to popular belief, listeners, this is not a focus disorder, it's a mood disorder, right? But part of the differences with this type of brain is that ADHD humans learn best while moving, right? And so this is something that I've always known about myself and have lived with. And when I see and look at how we're trying to enable people right now, 100% of it requires stationary, like I got to be sitting at the computer. I got to be sitting in this chair for a training, and it's not as effective as it could be. And so what I'm talking about with the podcasting and the internal sales podcast, so this is a new concept. If you want to be really particular, this is like a new corporate communications medium. And it represents a way to, again, meet sellers where they're at on the move, untether learning from being sitting at the computer, but it's a great way to scale out those best practices, those bright spots that we just spoke about, right? One of the things that most sales enablement people or even sales bosses don't talk about is that if you really get into it, most sellers actually learn the most from their peers. And so when you're able to create a system where the top performers on your team are actually turning around and teaching those around them. Number one, like when you're teaching other people, that is the base of the learning pyramid, right? When it comes to retention. So you're going to retain 90% of what you're teaching to other people. So there's that. But also, it's more relatable. Your people want to hear from those that are in their job doing the same thing. And so it's a fantastic way to expedite the pace of change and of progress. But it's also from a business perspective, like most of these sales enablement departments, like if you ask them about their engagement on the content that they're producing, maybe they bought that really pretty sales enablement platform, whether it's Seismic, HighSpot, MindTickle, and you actually get into the numbers of what's being used, it's not. And that is a crying shame as far as I'm concerned. And so like the jury is no longer out on whether or not podcasting is an effective way to train or to learn, right? Look at the numbers, right? Look at audiobooks, but also think about the caliber of attention. When I'm sitting in my chair and I've got a YouTube video open, right? I probably have got a bunch of other tabs also open, including my email and my Slack, and I'm hopping around between all these separate things. So my attention is divided. And so, but when I'm listening to a podcast, the people that tend to hone in are far more focused. They're far more engaged with what's happening. And so the effectiveness of the medium too is off the charts. And that it is half the cost of video production is just an icing on the cake. But what caused me to really want to do this is because, well, one, nobody was doing it, right? No one was doing it. And it got to a point where I was like, well, I guess it should be, it'll be me. Like, I'll help people do this. But then the second piece is that, like, I launched my show, and you can speak to this too, Scott. Like, I launched my show about like a year and a half ago at this point. It's been a very long time since I've taken on a learning curve as steep and as unforgiving as podcasting, right? Think about the reluctance to like actually listen to your call recordings and hear all the times you're interrupting someone or didn't ask the right question and it's grueling. Imagine learning as to how to be a host, and now you're going to take this awful F up or whatever, and you're going to publish it for all of time that everyone can hear. And so it's actually almost the majority of podcasts, they quit by like, I think it's episode 7 or 8.
Yeah, it's very few make it
pod
past
fade.
the first 5 or 10. Yeah.
And it's because it's hard. It's really hard. And so I wanted to come alongside of organizations, sales leaders or sales enablement leaders and help them to almost hack that learning curve, right? Because in many ways, how you start and how you finish is important. It's critical, right? Thanks to Dan Pink's, not his latest, but his When Scientific Benefits of Perfect Timing really got into that one. But it's even more important for an internal podcast, right? If you're an external show, you got a little bit more time to iterate. If you're an internal show, and you only launch once. And so the quality and the caliber of the show itself, it really needs to be there. And so another thing that I knew that I could help people with. And I love it, Scott. I love it. I'm so excited for this next year. I'm so excited, but even just on my stuff, like to design this company and this lifestyle around, wellness and operating in a healthy way. I'm also selling again. It's been a hot second since I've done that. So like the content that I'm producing is that much greater, but yeah, that's what's going on.
So if people are interested in taking advantage of, or at least learning about how they could be using this, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you or learn about how you could help them approach this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So LinkedIn is great, right? If you can get past spelling my last name, hopefully Scott will
not as bad as it looks.
Do you a solid and like link in there. I'm at amy@revenuereal.com. My cell phone, 646-630-0826. My show, Revenue Real Hotline, for anybody that wants to listen to, just a sample of the work that I'm doing. Same thing, revenuereal.com. I like the reviews. Are a great, I think, indicator of what great, like learning how to sell does not need to be drudgery, friends. It does not need to suck so hard. And so I'm delighted to answer any questions or have conversations in any capacity, whether it is, hey, I got zero budget and I have no idea what I'm doing, but I do want to try. Like, I'm very open to helping and serving. Hard stop. Come find me.
All right. Well, I know how much you spend your time and just like thinking through this. It's obvious with the podcast you've been doing, the LinkedIn posts that you post, the people that you work with every day. So I know you and I are just starting to get to know each other over the last couple of months, but it's been a joy for me to get to know you. And I'm looking forward to having you back on the show or maybe having you come in and train our clients a little bit as well. So
I'll see you tomorrow on my show. And also I'm going to get off this and I'm going to go back to reading your book. As you know, I was a little bitter about having to stop read it.
Well, I appreciate that. You're welcome anytime. I'm going to turn that audio clip into my ringtone, I think.
Good.
So that when the phone rings. Well, Amy, thank you so much for spending part of the day with us here on the show. As soon as we get this up, we'll share it with you. You can share it with your tribe as well.
And I absolutely will.
All right.
Listeners,
thanks very much for being on the show.
Always. Listeners, it was great meeting everyone. And truth, love, and joy all. Happy selling. Bye, Scott.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah. All right, folks, that's a wrap. After we finished the conversation and kind of went off air, if you will, first thing I said to Amy is like any one of those topics, any one of those threads could have been another 30, 45 minute, hour-long conversation. Obviously, she thinks deeply about this stuff. The world of sales training, sales enablement is highly complex. And what makes it more difficult is, of course, as a startup that is trying to sell your product, you're oftentimes selling that product into a marketplace that's never bought a product like yours before. And so you don't really have a model. You don't have a baseline on which you can just quickly copy and paste a sales process or a sales enablement process into your company and to become your company sales playbook. And that's why this is such an important topic. And this is why I wanted to have Amy on the show. So hope you enjoyed it. Definitely reach out to Amy. Check out her at revenuereal.com and also send her an email, amy@revenuereal.com. Sounds like the easiest thing for you to do if you want to learn more about the internal podcast or just want to check out Revenue Real and the podcast that she's doing there. In the meantime, if you haven't already liked or subscribed to this podcast, go ahead and do that. Leave us a recommendation, leave us a review, tell us how we're doing, give us ideas for the show, guests, topics, whatever. We do pay attention to those, of course. And most importantly, share this episode with a friend or 10. If you've got another startup founder that that could really benefit from starting to introduce them to this concept of sales enablement, why it's so important, or maybe they're really kind of topping out and they're hitting the glass ceiling when it comes to scaling sales. Maybe one of the reasons is because they don't have the right sales enablement process in place. And so maybe this episode could be a good start for them to think through what they need to do in order to get the repeatable, scalable sales that they want to get. So that's it for now. Thanks so much for listening to the Startup Selling Show, talking sales with Scott Sambucci. And we'll have another episode coming your way really soon. And in the meantime, thanks for listening. See ya.